Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Barclay Church, and this meeting is being hosted by the Friends of the Meadows and Bruntsfield Links. I'm the chair of the charity. My name is Jim Orr. If you don't know, we do a lot of good work in the Meadows. We've installed a lot of play equipment, table tennis tables, all these sorts of things. So if you like, you can take a look at our website and join up for £8, or you can leave your details at the door when you leave. And so this evening's meeting is a really interesting one. We've got two guys come to speak to us. We've got, firstly on my left is David Allan of the Hearts Museum, and next to him is Tom Wright, the Hibs club's historian. They're going to talk to us a little bit about the origins of football on the Meadows and the origins of the two big Edinburgh clubs, and a bit about the origins of association football in Scotland. And once I introduce Tom's going to go first. The two of them are going to take us through this interesting story. Once we take questions, there's going to be a roving microphone because we're recording everything for posterity. I just want to thank Neil Walker, our erstwhile secretary of the charity and a very prolific photographer around Edinburgh, whose idea this was to host the meeting. It's really gratifying to see so many of you here. And just before I start as well, some of you might know Frank Boyle, the cartoonist of the Evening News. Until a few years ago, he, as you might have seen on our Twitter account, he did a really beautiful illustration of the first Hibs Hearts game, and he's selling prints on his website, which is boylecartoon.com. And if you can't find it, you can email me at the convener of Friends of the Meadows. I'm sure you can find his details or my details. It's a really lovely drawing that he did. I've circulated a copy actually on our Twitter account. So I'm going to hand over now to Tom, who's got a little microphone of his own, and Tom's going to go first and take us through this story.
I was going to leave this for earlier, for later, folks, but just since it's been mentioned, that's a fantastic print that Frank Boyle done. The first game between Hibs and Hearts. Isn't it fantastic? Really, really good. And I'm not even on 10% commission. You can I thought an ideal place to start would be the origins of association football before Hibs and Hearts came to be in the Meadows and things like that. Football itself has been played for many, many hundreds of years in Britain. But it was all various rules, different rules, handling, hacking, carrying the ball, etc., etc. And they reckon the game itself originated in China, and it made its way across to Turkey, Greece, to Italy, and the Romans are said to have really started the game in this country as such. Association football, as I said, it was played in many different rules, but in the mid-1800s, a lot of the big colleges in England wanted to play each other, but they found great difficulty because they all had different rules. So in 1848, what was called the college rules, they were started, have been sort of amended a few times since, but that's where association football really started. The Football League Association started a few years later in 1863, the Scottish Association in 1873. Football, when it came to Scotland, association football was mainly played in the west of Scotland. In Edinburgh, the rugby, he'll be pleased to hear that, the rugby man here, rugby reigned supreme. So in December 1873, Queen's Park and a team called Clydesdale, they came through to play a game. They saw themselves as, missionaries for us scruffers in Edinburgh, and they played a game at Rhames Park, which is now Victoria Park. It was watched for a few hundred people, and from that, a lot of the people watching, they came away to form their own teams. 3rd Edinburgh Rifles, Swifts, Hanover, etc., White Star, and that's really how it started, association football. So, just before we go into the Hearts, I don't want to hog this as such, but how Hibs came to be involved. In the middle 1800s, there was a very severe potato famine when all the crops failed. And because most of the population were quite poor, the potato was their staple diet. And with little food to eat, they reckon a population of just over 8 million at the time, almost a million died of starvation and disease. Forced to move elsewhere, to look for food. Some of the lucky ones went to America, some to Australia, but most came to England and Scotland. Settling in, the majority settling in Glasgow. A lot went to Dundee where the jute mills provided work, but a lot came through to Edinburgh. There was 3 young lads, Michael Wellaghan and Malachi Byrne, which is a lovely, lovely poetic name, you know. They played for White Star, Team White Star, but they left to form their own team. And the team was made up of descendants of Irishmen, or people that had been born actually in Ireland. And they called the team Hibernian, after the Roman or Latin name for Ireland. And of course the traditional colours is green. Just before I go into, I've got the first minutes here, but although we go into the minutes say that they were wearing, the kit was to be a white Guernsey, but there's no actual photographic proof that they actually wore that. So this is a replica of the jersey that they wore at the time. Quite clever. It's a replica, by the way, so if you steal it, it's worth nothing, like, you know. Yeah. So that's kind of my introduction. So Davey will go into something if he wants to go about the Hearts thing.
Hearts' origins actually came about actually with the lure of young women was why Hearts were formed, right? Let's start playing football. Sir Walter Scott was the most famous novelist in the world, and when Sir Walter died, lots of things were named after him. So, for example, Waverley Station was named after the Waverley novels. One of the books he wrote was called The Heart of Midlothian, and the Heart of Midlothian was the old toll booth, which you can still see marked by the heart-shaped stones outside St Giles. And that's told the story of the Porteous riots when the toll booth was burnt down. Now, one of the things that was named after Sir Walter Scott's novel The Heart of Midlothian was the Quadrille Assembly Dancing Club. And this was a club that used to meet on Saturdays where you could meet girls and go dancing, right? So basically the young lads who worked in things like the Wellington Boot Factory, there were tinsmiths, there were chimney sweeps. They used to meet and go to this dance club. Now it's also coincided with the 1850s Factories Act, dictated that workers had a Saturday afternoon off from the latest at 2 p.m. So they had a Saturday afternoon off. What shall we do with our Saturday afternoons? Let's go and play sport. Now, the exact date of when the Heart of Midlothian Quadrille Assembly Club, the dancers went to play on the Meadows, is up for debate, because 100 years ago, around the 50th anniversary of the club, they were debating, like, when was the Heart of Midlothian Football Club formed. Tom Purdy, who was the first captain, he said 1873, some others said 1874, but as Tom alluded to, the first game of association wasn't played or wasn't demonstrated in Edinburgh until the last Saturday in 1873. So our thinking is that either some of the guys from the Assembly Club who'd been playing, say, a form of rugby on the Meadows went along and saw this, or they saw the people who did go along playing the thing in 1874. So the club stumped for 1874 as the date when they started playing on the Meadows, or started playing football. Now, one of the things about it is there's lots of unknowns, because Tom alluded to the fact that he said Hearts and Hibs had met 6 times on the Meadows. Now, so I've got, see the 6 green lines, sorry, 7 green lines. One of them, right, is before the first recorded game was Christmas Day 1875, right? But in the Hearts book by Albert Mackey, he quotes a guy, John Cochrane, who was in his 80s in the 1930s, saying that the first game was played on the Meadows and the Hearts won 3-1. But we can't find any other record of that game, because our source for this information is newspapers. And as Tom alluded to, rugby was the big sport. So if you do look at the Edinburgh papers from the 1875, 1876, 1877, they cover rugby, and association is very sporadic. So I was actually looking through numbers, And out the first 3 seasons, so the first season, we say 1875, 1876, there was 29 Saturdays where we don't know the result of a game or if a game was played. So 82% of the Saturdays we just don't know, and they must have been playing, but just it wasn't recorded. And overall, over the 3 seasons, there was about 60 Saturdays where we don't know what games were played, what association games were played, either for Hearts or Hibs. And my thinking is, as we've got 6 or 7 games that were played on the Meadows, out of the 60 missing games, probably at least a quarter were played between Hearts and Hibs. So there's probably like 15 games sort of missing from them that we just don't know about. And crucially, there was 2 Scottish Cup games, and they drew the first one 0-0 on the Meadows, and Hibs won the replay 2-1. And that's all the records. So I've looked at the Scotsman, the Evening News, the Edinburgh Courant, all the records of the fact they played the 2 games. They don't tell you the goal scorers, they don't tell you who played. And it's quite frustrating because some of the games in that year, like friendlies and things, they do give you the lineups. And I don't think we'll ever find them because it was only really the Edinburgh papers were recording any details of the players that played. But it'd be great to discover somebody's diary or journal that actually said, on this date we played them, and here's the players that played. And in that early era, believe it or not, right, up till Hibs won the Cup in 1887, Hibs were the far better team than Hearts. So overall, in that early era, Hibs won 25 games that we know of. Hearts won 8. There was 8 draws, and there was 2 games were abandoned by riots, and there was 2 games were disputed where Hearts turned up early and claimed the game, and then the following week they disputed it. So the SFA said, get on your bike, just play the match, right? But the 2 riots were for the Rosebery Charity Cup. It was meant to be a charity game. So the first game, Hibs were winning 2-0, and James McGee broke Peter Bell's leg, so the Hearts fans rioted. Then the following, in the replayed game, Hearts were winning 1-0. They got a second goal, and Hibs fans rioted, right? And eventually they played the game. But I think it was quite a rowdy area, I think, between the fans, I think, rather than the players. So, I'm just going to say, so in terms of the Meadows, if you look at that's the number of games I've got Hearts or St Andrews playing games on the Meadows, and the green ones are when we played a derby. And as I said, there's 60 odd Saturdays that we don't know games were played. So my thinking is that they must have played 15 or 20 derbies that just weren't recorded, because there were so few teams in Edinburgh, that the Hanover, Swifts, Hibs, Third Rifle Volunteers. So I reckon they were playing each other quite a lot. Just we don't know the results.
As you probably know, the first game between Hibs and Hearts, it took place on Christmas Day 1875. It took place approximately where the tennis courts in the Meadows are now. Doing research was, as David just said, is quite difficult when I checked everything. They played cricket in the West Meadows, and I was amazed how many, or how popular cricket was before the Football League. There was loads and loads of reports and that. And when Hibs played the Hearts on Christmas Day there, I looked up the Scotsman, and it devoted a whole 3 lines to the game. So it wasn't that popular with the people, It just says on Saturday, Hibs played Hearts in East Meadows, Hearts winning 1-0. I better tell them anyway. They played with 3 men short for 20 minutes, and still beat us. But I mentioned the first Hibs strip there, because there's a wee story to tell you about this. That's them wearing it in 1876. But there's a wee sad story that comes with this. I didn't know I'm doing this in order. There's a guy there called Andy Hughes, and it's a little-known tragic story. The Hibs were playing Irvine, wasn't it Irvine, was it something like that, on December 76. And him and his friends and some teammates were making their way home after the game. And at the corner of Nicholson Square, they came upon a man assaulting a woman. So Andrew here stepped in to try and sort things out, and the guy struck him with a heavy, heavy club. And apparently he also slightly stabbed one of his Hibs teammates, but I'll never be able to get that verified. But anyway, Andrew was quite badly hurt, so he was taken to the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. On the Monday, the guy that hit him with the club was fined 5 shillings, because at that time they wouldn't know that 2 days later Andrew Hughes would die. And it's quite sad, that it's a unknown sort of part of the story as such, Hibs, we're talking about the games played. To my reckoning, Hibs played 22. They would have played loads of games beforehand, but they weren't recorded, obviously, but Hibs played 22 games on the Meadows. They won 12, drew 4, and lost 6. So that's the kind of records about it as such, And I don't know what to mention it here, but we played the Hearts 5 times, and we beat them 3 times and drew another. But David just said that's wrong.
The rest of the mysterious game. So according to Mr. John Cochrane, so he said the first game between Hearts and Hibs, the newly formed Birmingham Football Club, took place in the Meadows in 1875, and Hearts won 3-1. But we can't find any corroboration of that game. So it's the 80-year-old Mr. Cochrane, writing in a newspaper in the 1930s, been quoted in 1959, right? And he names the team as well, right? But he doesn't tell you what date it was, right? So again, it's one sort of question mark. So if it was before the game in December 1875, it'd probably be sometime in November. But it's part of the frustration of trying to find out, from particularly the first 3 years, as Tom alluded to, there's lots of missing information. We just don't have it. And when you do find a new report and you find a new game, you get dead excited, right? And as I said, the Scottish Cup tie, where they played each other twice, that's one of the 4 competitive Hearts games that we don't have lineups for. And we'll probably never get them, unfortunately. But one of the great things that established, so Hibs were always going to be a big side ended because of their Irish background. But the game that established Hearts and Hibs as the main Edinburgh rivals was Edinburgh Football Association Cup, or the FA Cup. And it went to 4 replays, so there was 5 matches for it. And again, talking about newspapers, the Scotsman coverage got bigger and bigger, right? So the first couple of games, it was maybe a couple of paragraphs, and by the 5th game, it was almost a whole column. So that established association as a thing that was popularly reported. And after that, after that date, most of the games were recorded, right? So you can say sort of that 1878 game established association in the minds of certainly the press in Edinburgh, so we can see reports and lineups and things from that date. So Hearts won that EFA Cup. Now the following 3 editions of the EFA Cup, Hibs won, and Hibs got to keep it. And Tom could tell you more about the EFA Cup getting back to Easter Road.
Well, we won it in 1879, and for the next 8 years we only lost it once in the final, and that was because we couldn't raise a team against Edinburgh University in the final. So I'd like to think that we could have won it 8 times, right? But that's not the point. But when Hibs won it 3 years in a row, as was a habit at that time, clubs got to keep the trophies, so they had to replace it with something else, and they replaced it with what's the Edinburgh East of Scotland Shield, which, barring the COVID, the Hibs and Hearts, a lot of teams play for the East of Scotland, but Hibs and Hearts, first team when I was younger, used to play for it. It was a big, big fixture, and it went to the development squad as such. It's still played for today, although it's been held back by current circumstances, but I believe it's the 3rd oldest football trophy, association football trophy in the world still to be played for. And Davy's lucky that they've borrowed it for a wee while, like, you know, Ken.
Hibs won 10 years in the trot, from about 2005 to about 2016. Now, we'll trust you and we'll pass it round, right? But the illustration in the centre, right, which you'll see, is Arthur's seat in the background and the silhouette of players playing a football match, right? So Andy Mitchell, who's the Scottish football historian, he came to the museum and he said, do you realise that picture, right, in the centrepiece is the right one. Right. So Scotland played England in 1875 at the Oval, and that was an illustration of the match, right? So the ingenious manufacturer of the shield, he flipped the image round, and then on the shield, so on the shield, he's used that silhouette to actually put on the shield and put the medals in the background. And one of our volunteers, he actually went round the medals to see if he could see Arthur's seat with that sort of silhouette in the background. And he couldn't, right? Because the guy had made the thing up, right, essentially. And apparently the manufacturer of this shield did a Renfrewshire shield with the same silhouette as players in a different background. But we'll trust you, we'll pass it around, you can have a look at the illustration in the shield. Yeah. And also, as Tom alluded to, the wee shield on the back says winners of, and on the light shining, winners of former trophy, 3rd Edinburgh Rifle Volunteers, Thistle, Heart Midlothian, Hibernian, Hibernian, Hibernian. Right? And then you'll see round the outside the different names of the teams. And I think the missing shield, it must be one that was probably getting away to fill the new teams in. So, but we'll pass that around. It's an absolutely wonderful, wonderful trophy. I'll stick it on there. Bash it. Though it has got a few bashes in it because when they used to play it, so the big teams, they'd be carrying it around and dropping it and things. So it's got a few bashes in it.
The good thing about history is remembering the past. And David mentioned the Edinburgh Cup there, and we've got them at Easter Road, and they're going to be there in perpetuity for people coming after us, which is a fantastic thing. That's one of our displays that we had. That's the Edinburgh Cup, the Reserve Cup that we won, and there's the Edinburgh Shield. I'll let you look at these photographs later, folks, if you're interested, but that's another photograph, 1870s, with the Hibs and Hearts. The thing that's intriguing me about football, if you look at it, the game at that time had, rule-wise, has nothing to do with our game today. As Frank's, Boyle's cartoon shows, there's no lines on the pitch. Everything was flexible. The number of players that played, how long a game went on for, and the field was just done by corner flags as such. So it's a totally strange, different game. At one time, when the throw-in, the ball went out for a throw-in, it was the first player to the ball that got it, and they had to throw it like rugby at right angles as such, like, you know. Goalkeepers wore the same, even for many years, wore the same colour jersey as the team. Although goalkeepers could, handle the ball out to the halfway line, but once they got inside, if there was a box, they just had to, hold it, but they couldn't run with it. They had to throw it or kick it or something, like, you know, okay? So the whole game is totally and utterly different to what we know now, and totally and utterly different from what we know now, changing with VAR and all that kind of stuff, which is just incredible as such, like, you know, okay? It's mainly to talk about the Meadows as such, but The Meadows, with all the new football teams starting, there was, frantic fights to get the space that was allowed, as I'm saying, because cricket was played in the West in these days. And they would send representatives of the clubs down with their goalposts and that at 6 o'clock in the morning, and there was lots of skirmishes and everything, like arguing who's what to play on that pitch and that. So some of the more, because of that, with Hibs anyway, just almost the month, 2 years later, some of the, more ambitious sides, they had to move pitch. So Hibs moved down to a pitch at Mayfield, which became the Royal High School playing fields as such, like. And it's no far from Powburn, where Powburn initially was the Royal Hippodrome for athletics. 3rd Edinburgh Rifles used that for their home ground. They were seen as the first association team in Edinburgh, but they moved to Stockbridge within a short space. And I think...
So as Tom alluded to, the problem with the Meadows was if you didn't pitch up early, you couldn't play, right? So they moved to things like enclosed spaces. So cricket grounds were used because it was an enclosed space. So you could guarantee you were going to get a game, right? But you could also charge money for it, right? So it was a sort of double attraction. Was you were going to guarantee that you could play, but you could charge money. And in those days it was a tanner, 6p or 2.5p in current money, and ladies got in for free. And the ladies, it was still going on in the 1890s, early 1900s. And in fact, looking through the Hearts minute books, the 1950s, they say that ladies should no longer be getting charged. The boys, the ladies had to pay full price in the 1950s, but they were still getting in that sort of either free or bargain rate. So that's why the Meadows, was stopped being used for football. But in 1886, both Hearts and Hibs played one last time on the Meadows, because there was the Great Edinburgh Exhibition of 1886, and towards the end, there was 3 cup finals were played, and where's my results one? So in the second cup final, Hibs played the great Glasgow 3rd Lanark team and won 2-1. And the second, that was on a Thursday, because it was a Glasgow holiday on the Thursday, so I think they'd expect a lot of people would travel through to see the exhibition and also see the football. And Hearts played Renton on the Friday and lost 2-1. So that was played at the great Edinburgh Exhibition grounds, which, looking at the map, must have been on the East Meadows, because the West Meadows was taken up by the exhibition. And I've got a few illustrations of what the exhibition looked like. So basically I've got a plan of the Meadows, and then the opening, and then there's a couple of illustrations of what it looked like. And there was hot air ballooning and all sorts of things going on, so we can pass those round as well. Yeah. So that was the last time that Hearts and Hibs played on the Meadows. That was about sort of 8 years after they stopped playing on the Meadows. They played a game on the Meadows for the Great Exhibition. And it seemed extraordinary looking at the thing. They built like a whole enormous building on the Meadows, and it was there for 6 months, and then got dismantled.
It was meant to be permanent. They were trying to force the thing through. There was a gigantic, you'll see photographs, a gigantic building, but there's also lots of other buildings round about. But surely they must have known, I think it was 1823, there was an Act of Parliament that they weren't allowed to build anything on the Meadows, and it remains today. I think there used to be a cottage in Melville Drive, and that was where the porter for the Sick Children's Hospital lived, because my dad was in the running for it at one time, like as such, But you can't believe they spent all that money and didn't realise an Act of Parliament would stop them for leaving it up for good. And I think the only thing that remains today, if they might have been taken away for renovation, was the jawbones, the Wales jawbones that they walk through as such. But just about the game, folks, I'm trying to fit in if this is the right way to do things as such. I've been in contact with the Hearts for a wee while here. It started a couple of years ago, but the whole project was, held back because of the COVID. But we got an actual commemorative plaque printed. We have it. It's at Tynecastle at the moment. And I'm going in to see, on Tuesday, see the lassie Leanne, because they've got to put up, do you know the wee dead end road that comes down? I can't mind what it's called. Towards, what do you call it, where the tennis courts are? The Burlock. Aye. Well, by coincidence, there's a building right at the very, very bottom of that most of the buildings are, what do you call it, 90 degrees. This has got an angle cut that's facing the Meadows, and they've given us permission to get that unveiled there, and hopefully we'll have directors, players, hopefully, and that for the Hibs and Hearts.
It was all planned to get done, and then COVID hit. So the plaque got manufactured at least 2 years ago, if not longer. Probably coming on for 3 years ago. So basically, it's commemorate that first recorded game on Christmas Day 1875, and it'll be, it's almost exactly in the spot where the game was played.
The first rules of the Hibs have got that the players have got to train every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday if there's no game on the Meadows. So they were right into the Meadows before the game started actually taking place. But David's mentioned the Hearts. From what we can tell, although records are difficult to trace with accuracy, but Hibs have played 22 times in the Meadows. As I said, winning 12, drawing 4 and losing 6 as such, But it was imperative that it moved because there was more and more football clubs starting. And because Edinburgh was very confined at that time, there wasn't that many places to play. And where there was, it'd be rugby mainly. So they had to start moving out, And Hearts went to Powburn and Hibs went to Mayfield,
And then eventually we moved west to Tynecastle. And then first of all, what we call the first Tynecastle. The unfortunate thing is, the maps that exist, there's a map from 1880 which shows it as Fields, and there's a map from 1886 which shows it as Wardlow Playful Houses. So there's not a map for the intermediate years to know exactly where the pitch was, right? But part of the problem was where they moved to. There was 2 pitches, and it was on the bottom. They used to get waterlogged because the water used to run down the hill. And there's one instance where the second team were playing, and then it records the first team couldn't play for want of a ball, right? So they only had 1 ball, right? So they couldn't play the first team game because the ball was missing, or they only had 1 ball or whatever, right? So that was quite an amusing reason. And in 1886 they moved to the current Tynecastle, so they've been there, getting on for 136 years.
Somebody will check on this.
Yeah. So, and then Hibs had the Birmingham Park.
Can I go into
yeah, so you'll do that.
No, it's just because there's something in between, Hibs played at Mayfield for a wee while, but then they moved to Powder Hall. That was the old Powder Hall that's no longer there as such. Well, none are no longer there now, but the first one. And when they left to go to the first Easter Road Park, Hearts took over Powder Hall for a wee while before moving out to Gorgie as such. The first Easter Road Park is, what do you call it? It's the Hibs Supporters Club. I know some of these guys there know it well. You can tell with their beer bellies and things like that. That is actually on the site of the very, very first Easter Road Park. And a couple of very important games took place there. One that was particularly keen for me, as such, and current, circumstances with ladies football. On that park, the first Easter Road Park, on the 7th of May 1881, that is where the very first Association Women's Football International took place. Scotland beating England 3-0. A lot of the ladies wouldn't recognise so much with the men in that. They were playing under assumed names. So the first goal scorer is called Lily St. Clair. So I'm not sure that was actually a real name as such, But also that same park, a few years later, that is where the very first men's Scottish International took place outside of Glasgow, when Scotland beat Wales 5-0. And the Hibs player, Willie Groves, was the first Hibs player to score an international goal. So we have moved around. I don't know, there's something else to come by when we move there. You want to go into something else? Or?
No, well, funny enough, talking about women's football is we've got an advert for a women's game at Tynecastle in the evening news on the Monday, right? And the game was played on the Monday evening. We cannot find out if the game was played or not, right? They've got the advert for the game. None of the local papers report the score. Now, it could be that the game was abandoned because the following night they played a game in Airdrie and they got stoned off the pitch, right? So there was lots of hooting and the stones were thrown at the players so they couldn't play the game. So possibly that happened to the game at Tynecastle, but just haven't been able to find the result, even though the advert is on the day of the match, right? It's not as if it was advertised the week before and the game was, cancelled. It was actually the evening news on the Monday is advertising the game on the Monday evening. We just can't find the result out. So it's a bit of a mystery.
The first Easter Road ground I'm talking about, a couple of years ago, we put a plaque up outside the supporters club to let everybody know that's where it was, as such. While they were playing on that ground, Hibs won the Scottish Cup in 1887. I think they were the first team for East of Scotland to win the Cup as such. But things were deteriorating fast. They didn't have a very good relationship with the owners of the land, the Edinburgh Hospital Trust. And it was only a year-to-year basis on that. So they decided that they wanted to build houses on it or sell it to somebody else. So that was the first thing. The secretary absconding to America where the club funds didn't help either at that same time. A couple of other things. The newly formed Celtic decided that it would be a good idea to poach or get out a few of our good players, and that sort of severely weakened the team. But one of the things that really done it, I think, and it stopped the Hibs from being one of the teams invited to take part in the very first formation of the Scottish League, is that I forgot where I was going there. Where was it? No, seriously. St Bernard's and Renton, they played a game that was disputed around about that time. So they were asked by the SFA or the authorities at the time to hand in their books, their company books, and they were found to be false. So the SFA put a directive to all the clubs in Scotland to hand in their books. Well, it turned out apparently that, like most clubs at the time, Hibs had two sets of books. The real set, although it had been, three different secretaries, it was all written in the same pen. So they reckoned that'd be caught out with SFA. So they just, with all the other current problems that were happening, they just decided to disband. That was in 1891.
And then Hearts were the first Eastern team to join the league, and the same season they beat Dumbarton in the Scottish Cup final to become the second Eastern team to win the Scottish Cup. And it doesn't sound like a big thing, to beat Dumbarton. Right? What were Dumbarton? Well, they were joint league champions that season with Rangers, and they won the league the following season. And in February 1891, Hearts beat them 1-0 to win the Scottish Cup. But in the league games, either side, they got well beaten in the home and away league games. So it was a big shock for Hearts to win the Scottish Cup in 1891. And then 5 years later, they met Hibs in the final at Logie Green. It was the only Scottish Cup final to be played outside Glasgow.
That's a picture of the game. If you're walking or driving down Logie Green Road, if you take the middle third, the street, that's roughly Goalmouth to Goalmouth where the game was played. Hearts won 3-1 as such, I don't know if my wife knows that the game was actually played there, because every time I go up Logie Green Road, I said, "Did you ken this?" Yeah.
We've got a series of 12 photograph images, and a couple of them you can see the train on the embankment. The embankment's still there, so I don't know whether they've stopped to let the passengers see the game or whatever, right? But you can see the train in the background. And it's also, they've got some strange goal markings. There's various websites you can go and you can see how the markings on the football pitch evolved over time. But there's funny sort of semicircular things near the goalpost, and also Hearts got a penalty early on, and Davy Baird scored it, but in those days, there was no penalty spot. You took the penalty kick from anywhere along the 18, well, not 18, but along a line rather than from a spot. And funny enough, in the 2012 Cup finals, I was at table in hospitality. Somebody said to me, who was the first goal scorer in the 1896 Cup final? I said, Davy Baird. And the guy goes, well, Darren Barr's got the same initials. So he put 20 quid on it, 40 to 1, and Darren Barr scored the first goal, so he got 800 quid. None of the rest of us put the money on, because that seems too ridiculous odds. So a bit of history won somebody 800 quid.
I said earlier that Hibs went out of business in 1891, but a couple of years later, 1893, or it really started in 1892, but in 1893, what had previously just been one Scottish league became two Scottish leagues, and Hibs were invited in. I believe there was some people against Hibs joining for some reason or other. But they won the league that year, but because promotion wasn't automatic, it went to a vote by the First Division clubs. Hibs stayed in the Second Division, but won it again the next year, and had to actually, be allowed into the First Division. By now, of course, they're playing in the present Easter Road. Davy mentioned penalty kicks. Nothing to do with Hibs or Hearts, but just 100 yards from Easter Road used to be Leith Athletics St Bernard's Beechwood Park. And it was there in 1891, and I'm proud of this myself, even though it's nothing to do with the Hibs, is that was where the very first official penalty kick in the entire world took place. When a guy, McCall, a Scotland cap for Renton, scored against Leith Athletic that day, Leith themselves missing a penalty. There's a couple of Airdrie, they claimed the title of being the first, but they played at Mavis Bank, and it was a friendly before the official ruling came in. So I think Leith Athletic can be proud that they took the very first. And these things are the entire world, which is just fantastic.
So Tom's actually reminded me, the reason the penalty kick got introduced was when Hearts won the Scottish Cup in 1891, in the quarter-final they played East Stirling, and their full-back, Jimmy Adams, he fisted the ball out from under the bar, right? And in those days there was no penalty, right? And it was like the ball was going in, and it was just an outrage. And it caused such an uproar that the Irish FA, because at those points the rules were set by the Irish Football Association, the Scottish Football Association, the English Football Association, and the Irish wanted to bring in a penalty for things like fisting the ball out from under the bar. But the English and the Scots weren't really keen on it. But the furore caused by Jimmy Adams punching the ball out from underneath the crossbar, the Scots then were minded to do it. And a similar thing happened in, I think it was Derby County were playing an FA Cup tie, and a similar thing happened. So the FA and the SFA said, we'll report the introduction of the penalty kick. So you could say Hearts, the dastardly Hearts were responsible for the penalty kick getting introduced.
The tricky thing about penalty kicks in the early days is that you had to claim for it. The umpire, or maybe the referee, I don't think it was umpires, they wouldn't give anything unless you claimed for a penalty. And then, it used to be where the 18-yard line spot is now, the 12-yard spot, penalty spot, there used to be a line halfway along, and you would take the kick for anywhere on that line. But goalkeepers were allowed to encroach 6 yards, making it more difficult than that. So I don't know if the rules are better or worse now as such, but that's how it used to be, you know.
Well, right.
Spot on time, brilliant.
Yeah.
That was very interesting. I said to our two guests, we could, if they could chat together for about 45 minutes, which is spot on time. And we've got a roving mic, which is carried by Mike. And we're very happy to take any questions, or if anyone's got any comments or jokes or anything, please put your hand up. Oh,
Hello, is this working? Can I ask, were the very early games on the Meadows, were they ticketed? And how much would those tickets relate to today's cost?
We've not found any evidence that there was actually any pricing, because part of the thing, because it was an open space. Mm-hmm. So it's only when they moved to enclosed spaces they start actually charging money. So I'm not saying they weren't, but as far as I'm aware, they didn't charge money for it. But I don't know if Tom can...
I don't think they did, but if they did, they would falsify the numbers that were there anyway. Okay. And by the way, for any other questions, I'm only prepared to answer questions I know the answer to. So if you...
Hi, I wonder if you could just mention the First World War, McRae's battalion and Hearts and Hibs, or the other
Okay,
teams.
right, yes. So, question about the McRae's battalion. So, those not aware of the story, Hearts manager in 1914 was a guy called John McCartney, and he'd assembled a team that was going to win the league, right? Including they played champion Celtic the first game of the season. It was the first game in front of the newly built stand at Tynecastle. Hearts beat the champions 2-0. They won their first 8 games, top of the league. But at that point, World War I had broken out, and it culminated in a lady writing to the Edinburgh Evening News, and she said, how can Hearts call themselves Heart and Midlothian while soldiers are dying out in France? They should change the name to the White Feathers in Midlothian. And that caused a big hoo-ha. And so George McRae, he decided to raise a battalion, local battalion in Edinburgh. And he actually approached the Hearts director, can I come and speak to the players? So he came to Tynecastle in November 1914. 11 of the players agreed to join the battalion. Now, unfortunately, in some things it's been miscrewed that the entire Hearts team signed up. It was roughly half were first team players and half were reserve players. And this got been repeated in various books, but say a lot of the players did, but some of the players would have reserved professions that they wouldn't be allowed to sign up, and some just didn't want to sign up. But that culminated in a rally at the newly opened Usher Hall, and within a week, 1,600 had signed up from McRae's, and a lot of them were supporters of Hearts and Hibs, and there was players from Wraith Rovers and Falkirk who signed up as well. And sadly, there was 7 players who had signed up from Hearts died during World War I, but we've also recently found out that there was 9 players who had been with Hearts, but weren't with Hearts when they signed up, including Bobby Atherton, who was Hibs captain when they won the Cup in 1902 and the League in 1903. So we know there's at least 16 players in association with Hearts that died during World War I. And also a lot of them some of them we said they were going to join up with the McRae's actually served in different regiments, because depending on your profession, you might get sent to a different regiment. So if you had an engineering skill, you went to engineers. Charlie Thompson, who was the great Hearts captain in the 1900s, he was a baker by trade. He served in the military. What do you call it? What would you call army cooks? What's the word for army cooks? Catering corps. He served in the Italian catering corps. So depending on your profession, you might have served in a different battalion. So as a result of that, there was a big outpouring on, towards the Hearts. So Hearts had a big campaign to raise money, and the Haymarket War Memorial was opened in 1922. And every year, the fans gather, including Tom always comes on behalf of Hibs and lays a wreath on behalf of Hibs. And Tom also goes to Conto Maison. There's a cairn out there, and Tom represents Hibs out there.
And privileged to represent Hibs there. The cairn was, we call it, the constructor, the idea came from a group of Hearts supporters, but it commemorates Hearts, Hibs, Dunfermline, Wraith Rovers, Falkirk, things like that, which is fantastic, because we sometimes forget that most clubs lost players, which is just a terrible, terrible thing. But the McRae's battalion, and it's nothing against the McRae's battalion, but at that time there was a reserve Royal Scots based around about Leith and that, and Haddington, etc., East Lothian. They joined up a lot of supporters for the Hibs joined the Royal Scots Reserve Battalion, and they were amongst the group that made their way to fight abroad when they were caught up in the Gretna disaster, which is still to this day the greatest train number of deaths. 216 died as such, But back to the McRae's again. Several Hibs supporters did join that. One of them was the great Hibs chairman, Harry Swan. He joined the McRae's battalion, but had to retire for medical reasons. But a guy called Sandy Grossart, the Hibs player, registered Hibs player throughout the campaign, he joined the McRae's battalion. But after a year, he decided to join the Machine Gun Corps. But he actually was awarded the Military Cross in 1916, I think it was, which is really fantastic. But the Great War, as we're seeing what's going on in, Ukraine at the moment, the horrors and everything, the Great War is no about football teams or anything like that. It's about just all these guys and landladies that just went there and gave their lives, and the old saying as such, but for our today, yeah.
Could you say a little bit about the background to some of the early players who played on the Meadows in the 1870s?
There's no a lot. I mentioned the three earlier. Andy Hughes simply died. Michael Wellahan, he was another one, and he is the great uncle Pat Stanton, who by pure coincidence, 100 years later in the Hibs centenary, was the captain of Hibs at that time. The Malachi, or whatever, Byrne, obviously of Irish descent, I think. He was one of the other ones. But there's very little known really at the time. Most of the publicity is about later players like, Bobby Atherton, they're talking about later. The great Harry Rennie, the goalkeeper, who played for Hearts at first, and so my forte is the 50s, 60s and 70s.
I'll say a little bit about two of the players that you can see in Frank's magnificent cartoon. So the goalkeeper was Three Fingers Reid, so he had three fingers on his hand. So we found out from one of his descendants what hand it was. So in Frank's cartoon you can see the goalkeeper's got three fingers in one hand. And Tom Purdy was the great Hearts captain that era, and apparently they played a one-on-one game to decide who was going to be captain. Whether that's true or not, but it's been reported in various that they played this one-off game. And a lot of them, as we said, their background was going to the dance hall on the Saturday night to see ladies, and that's what we do on our Saturday afternoons.
It was interesting, first of all, that you asked that question. Did you have a reason for it? Was there a family member played for the club at that time, or?
Oh, Jake Reid. Was it you?
That's the question. I thought you were talking about the Hibs players, Yeah. Aye.
Can I ask a question about the very first game? I have a story in my mind and I don't quite know how true it is. So if I tell you the story, can you tell me if I'm talking nonsense or not? Would that be okay? So I kind of had this feeling that there was an embargo placed against Hibernian, and that originally it was the Edinburgh Football Association didn't know what to do, passed it to the SFA, who said this is a league for Scots, not for Irishmen, or something to that nature. And in the story that I have in my head, the first football match that took place, Hearts broke that embargo by playing Hibs. Is that true? And if so, what were the reasons that Hearts did that? It strikes me as a nice thing. I want it to be a nice story, so I'm hoping that there's... Information's
a difficult thing for 150 years ago to get as such like. But when Hibs played Hearts on the Meadows on Christmas Day 1875, they weren't at that time in the Edinburgh Association. It was just after that they applied to join the association, but they were refused because they hadn't been members of the National Association, SFA and that. So when they applied to them, they were turned down saying that our association caters for Scotsmen, not Irishmen. So they weren't allowed into that either. So they went back to the Edinburgh Association and they again refused them. And it wasn't such anything to do with the Hearts as a team, but several of the prominent players at that time, including a couple of the Hearts, they insisted that Hibs should be allowed to join the association, and they were. Don't know if that muddies the waters or clears it up, like, you know.
Yeah. It is one of those things that it's very hard to get hard facts unless you've got a newspaper from a date and said this game was played, this was the score. So a lot of the stories are taken from newspaper articles looking back 20 years. There's one that was written that said, Hearts went to play Haddington Rangers, and they discovered that Haddington Rangers had 12 players at the end of the first half. So they were winning 1-0, and they took the 12th player off, and Hearts eventually won 20-0, right? But there's no date against the thing, right? It just said this was a game that was played. So it's people writing about things that happened 20, 30, 40 years in the past. So you've got to sort of take them with a pinch of salt, including the one, apparently the guys from the Assembly Club were kicking a ball about at the Hartwood Lothian near St Giles, and were told by a policeman to buy a ball and go down and play on the Meadows, right? And I've seen that in several different newspaper accounts. Possibly it was true, but it seems very convenient they were playing near the Hartwood Lothian to get told to go and play in the Meadows, when the Meadows was known as the place where you used to play sport. And a similar one is, Hearts went defunct for a short period, and a lot of the players went to play for a team called St Andrews, who had red, white and blue strips. And so myth is given that they put them in the boil wash and the colours ran and they dyed maroon. That's why the maroon strip. Right? But our understanding is that there's a photograph where you can see the stripes underneath the strip. So we think they were deliberately dyed maroon or maroon. Right? It was deliberate action rather than the colours running by mistake. But again, it's how do you separate sort of the myths part and the story that it gets published in various books and things, and it becomes part of the truth, inverted commas, right? So we try and separate the truth from the actual things we know that definitely happened.
Just a footnote to that. The accuracy in the old days with the newspapers was sort of under question, certainly. But there's something that's quite relevant to the World Cup as such today. This is regarding newspapers' coverage. In 1950, England represented Britain in the World Cup in Brazil. In the second round, they played a team called USA, who were rank underdogs, were not given a slightest chance of winning. England, I believe, were 70-1, some say, to win the game. Well, England, in one of the biggest embarrassments of the World Cup to this day, and they talk about it now, they got beat 1-0. But the press in England couldn't believe it. They thought, no, it's obviously a misprint. They must have won 10-1. So that was in all the papers and everything. So that was in 1950. So inaccuracy of the press, no even taking into consideration the bias of the press at times, like, you know. So I just thought I'd throw that daftly footnote in, like, you know.
And also that World Cup, Scotland refused to go, even though they were invited, because they didn't win the British Championship, right? They said, we're not going unless we're British champions. And despite Brazil saying, look, you're one of the founding nations of football, we want you to play, they refused to go. And there was only 13 teams played, so Scotland didn't go because they weren't British champions. France didn't go because it was too far to go by boat to Brazil. And India didn't go because they weren't allowed to play in bare feet. Right? So just some quirks.
Scotland no gone actually was, I always put the blame down anti-Hearts, such. I'm joking, by the way. Scotland only said they would go to the World Cup if they were winners. Well, they'd won the tournament the year before, and they only needed a draw in the last game against England that would have made them retain the title as such, so they would have went to Brazil as such. But a guy, they were getting beat 1-0 midway through the second half, and a guy, I don't know if you heard of him, just a guy called Willie Bald, blasted the ball against the bar and over the safety, so that was Scotland B. And I'm only kidding. I'm a great admirer of Willie Baldwin.
And there's some great scrapbook illustrations. You see, if they do the dotted line with the arrow, here's the ball hitting the bar and the ball bouncing out. Right? So, but it was not. It was weird that because even after the Brazil said, "Look, we want you to come." Right? You're such an important nation, just refused to go. And also, the following World Cup, they were so cheapskate, right, that they picked a squad of 22 players, but they only let 13 go to Switzerland. They didn't want to pay their travel, so there were 9 at home are reserves. That if somebody got injured, they'd get flown out or whatever. Right? But they only sent 13 players.
There was 41 in the party to the management, backroom staff, the selectors and their wives, and only 13 players. But strangely, only one goalkeeper, which is just incredible as such. And it's well recorded here. You'll know the story already. But when the Scotland captain, he went up to shake hands with the first game Austrian captain, he was presented with a pennant. And he didn't have anything to give back, and he says, I felt embarrassed about that as such. But even the lack of organisation, the players, there was no training kit. They had to wear their own team kits and things like that. And one of the players called themselves the Licorice All Sorts because they were all different colours and that,
Is the Hearts Hibs fixture the world's oldest derby football match? Continuously played?
No. It depends how you define it, because in Scotland, right, if you count Queen's Park versus Rangers, it was played in November 1875, right? And the earliest date we have for a Hearts Hibs game is Christmas Day 1875, but there was always blank Saturdays, so I'm convinced that they played each other before November 1875, which don't have a date for it. Right? So in some ways, possibly yes, you don't count, because Queen's Park don't really play Rangers regularly anymore, right? So in terms of two teams that regularly play each other, in some ways you could say yes.
It was just to ask, when did they start to actually pay the players, and how much were they getting paid?
Okay. Well, I'll start with the Hearts one, right? So, officially, professionalism only came in 1893, I think, right? But Hearts got kicked out in SFA for paying players in 1884, right? Basically, all the clubs were doing it, right? They were paying players unofficially, and Hearts got caught. So, officially, professionalism came in I think, 1893. Unofficially, they were getting paid.
When Hibs won the Scottish Cup in 1887, they beat Bailey Leven, I think it was, in the semi-final, maybe in Renton. They beat them to get into the final, but a protest was put in that Hibs were paying one of the players, a guy called Willie Groves. So it was taken under the authorities' control to look into it. So they had a big meeting before the final, but they couldn't reach an agreement. So they held the next meeting of the authorities back to after the cup final itself. So Hibs actually beat Dumbarton in the Scottish Cup final in 1887, no realising would they be winners or would they not. And it went to the deciding vote of the chairman to say that Hibs. But the complaint made against Willie Groves was that he was seen eating breakfast and he was getting paid by the Hibs. And also he used to get compensation in these days for your time off your work to play for the clubs and that. And the rumour was, how they found it I don't know, that he was actually getting 3 times his actual wage for his work for the Hibs. But it was thrown out rightly anyway.
Can I just ask, you've talked about what the players wore, but what about the weight of the ball, what it was made with, and what the shoes that they were actually wearing? Did they have studs, or did they have anything like that at the time?
The ball, I was going to actually bring a replica ball today, and it's great when you have the school tours, East Road and things like Ortine Castle, because nowadays the balls are plastic coated so the water doesn't affect them. But even in my younger days, it was the brown leather balls, and when you're playing in heavy, heavy rain, the water would really, really soak into the leather. And when you went to head it, you went, poof, okay. It would cause the modern players at least to roll over 7 times, when they'd done that. But also they had the lace in these days, and if you were unlucky to catch it, you could cut your eye open with the lace as such, what was your other question? The boots, dear, the boots. There's a bit, I've got the first Hibs rules here, and there's a bit in it telling the players what's to be shown with their nails, as they called them. That would be before studs came into being. They would have nails, but there were dimensions of what was allowed to be seen in that,
So, the book I've got here is Story of the Hearts. It was published in 1924. That's the first team picture. And the players have got long white trousers on like cricketers wear. And basically they're wearing boots, almost like working boots. And illustrated in Frank's magnificent cartoon. So, but within 3 years, in the next photograph, they've got long shorts. So at some point they switch from the cricket style trousers to long shorts.
Yeah, Hibs used to have, I showed you that original strip there, used to have white trousers with a green stripe down them such. So.
And the earlier question, somebody said how much the players got paid. So we've got Davy Baird's wage book from 1896. So he got paid, when you count all the bonus money, about £140. And that was about 3.5 times the amount a skilled mill worker got. So he was the best paid player in the club. But if he didn't play, he was on, I think it was £3 a week, normal wage, but if he didn't play, he was on £1.50 or £1.10. So if he didn't play, you were on basically half wages. So it was a good wage, but it wasn't earth-shattering like some of the top players get now. And then in 1956, when they won the cup, they got wages booked for that. The players were on £16 or £20 a week, and they got £100 bonus for winning the cup. And after tax, it was about £70 they got, which again was a good wage for 1950s, but it wasn't going to change your life,
Ironically, professionalism came in probably because Preston North End, I think it was in 1884, they were found to be paying some of their players, and they were thrown out of the FA Cup that season. But the Preston owner, he was really adamant. He said, this is not right, these people. So it was through them that professionalism came into England. I think it was 1885, before us as such. So, and it was only fair that they were given time up and things like that should get paid. So that's where professionalism came from, with Preston North End's protests. It's quite interesting.
Hi David, you mentioned about the cups that were played for during the exhibition in 1886. Do we know if those cups still exist and whether they're on display somewhere?
So I would think Tom's got his cup because Hibs won it, but we didn't win the cup, so Renton won the cup, so Renton will have that cup. So I'd imagine it'll be something somewhere, but it's not one we have. But we're hopeful, with our 150th anniversary coming up, and then Hibs one's coming up, there's about 16 trophies that both clubs have played for over the years. So I mentioned this to talk. So if we can get a loan of the ones Hibs has got for an evening, we'll have an evening at Tynecastle with all the cups. We will reciprocate the following year, and Hibs can get all the cups. So we can have a session. We can actually see all 15 or 16 cups that we played for over the various years. So roughly about half and half at either Easter Road or Tynecastle. So Hibs have got the original EFA Cup. They've got
the Wilson Cup.
Yeah. The Tom Hart Trophy. So there's a few.
As to your question there, they played 3 games in the Meadows during the Empire Exhibition, but they weren't, tournaments as such. They were just one-offs one-offs. So, and I believe that, both teams would probably get some sort of memento, but to this day I've never seen anything,
At which point in their history did football clubs become a commodity which became of interest to businessmen to invest in, some of whom have a rather dubious background?
I'm not sure.
On both sides.
In terms of Hearts, it became a limited company in 1901, but because of lack of investment, they almost went bust in 1905 and 1906. But I suppose really in terms of having owners coming in, you could really say, from a Hearts perspective, you could probably say Wallace Mercer was the first real sort of proper owner as such, who took that sort of overall interest, who sort of put his head above the parapet as opposed to being just somebody who was the chairman in terms of the share. He was the first one that really you could say was inverted commas an owner, right? Because up to that point it was owned by the shareholders, but Wallace was the first one who put his money and bought the club. And you could say he did well. We almost won the league in the cup in 1986. But by the time he sold the club, he'd increased the debt, and then when Robert Danes came in, by the time they sold the club, they increased the debt, and then Romanov came in, and the club almost went into liquidation. So I'm not trying to, it's
difficult.
It's difficult to put an exact answer on it, but really I would say, it's a relatively modern thing in terms of one person or one group of people want to own the club as such.
Hibs became a limited company in 1903, but it would be shareholders and things like that. But I think they reckon that the first person that could actually be really called the owner would be Harry Swan. He sold it on latterly. Sorry. But regarding the whole thing, we're kind of switching tangents here a wee bit about the financial side. Football has always been about money, but it used to be football-led. But now, unfortunately, it's money-led. And it's like football secondary, it's how much money we'll get for this. When any team gets into the European Cup, for instance, it's not a case of, we could maybe get to the semi-final or something. So you get £15 million for this, you get so-and-so, so-and-so. When Rangers got knocked out of the Europe recently, Celtic, they got knocked out. A reporter had wondered how they're going to do for the money. What would they do for the money now? Well, if you've got to rely on competitions for your money and that, it's no my game. Sorry to be old-fashioned there.
Quick question, please. So you mentioned the World Cup. What about any cross-border competitions with England? And I understand that some of these games were referred to as the Club World Championships, even within the British Isles.
Just a few months after Hibs won the Scottish Cup in 1887, they played Preston North End, who were the FA Cup winners, in a friendly Easter Road, the first Easter Road ground. And although it was entirely unofficial, the press jumped on it as champions of the world. So although it's unofficial, we still take great credit. We were world champions for a time as such. I believe that although it was claimed for various other games, that the last time, in 1903, I think it was, that Renton played an English club, and that was official for, both associations. They became the world champions, and it's never been played for us since. Sorry? Was it? Well, that's a year after then, anyway. Ken. But that was the last time it was played for officially.
So unofficially, Hearts played Sunderland in, it was either 1895 or 1897. They were both league champions, and they played for the World Championship, and Sunderland won 5-3. And in 1901, Spurs were the last amateur team to win the FA Cup. Hearts played them on a home and away basis and drew 0-0 down in London, and they played them back here in New Year 1902 and won 3-1, and they've declared themselves world champions. I'm not sure whether, even unofficial, whether it was continued, but it was either the two league winners would play each other, or the holders of the FA Cups would play for the World Championship.
Thanks very much. I was wondering if we knew much about the supporters. So, to the point about what's the point of football, do we know how many people would turn up to the Meadows, how quickly it became popular? Because when you talk about both clubs then moving to different grounds, quite quickly they've got stands, and therefore there must have been large crowds going. So do we know much about how quickly it became popular with supporters?
There wouldn't be any figures released for the games in the Meadows, but even in Mayfield or Powburn, I don't know here this, maybe in Mayfield certainly, there wouldn't be terracings as such, so people, if they didn't pay to get in, they would be asked for a collection, so I'm not sure any sort of numbers.
There's the odd one or two games where they mention figures like 300 or 500. Not necessarily on the Meadows, but on things. But as Tom said, once they moved to the ground, they started to build terracing, they built stands. So, in fact, the first Derby played at the current Easter Road. It was a sold-out Easter Road, and there was 8,000 at the game. That was 1893. But by the time professionalism and the leagues, by the time the leagues came in, they were getting crowds of 5,000, 10,000 for some games. And as I said, ladies got in for free.
A few of the English clubs started that to try and calm down some of the wild supporters in the games. They allowed ladies in free, but they had to stop it because they started to attract too many women. We're getting about 2,000 women were coming to some of the games and that, so that was quickly stopped as such, But capacities, it's quite interesting to see Qatar's game there, that the official figure attendance was 88,340 or something, when the official capacity of the stadium was only 80,000. So you can take what you want out of that. And also throughout time, there's always been the 40,000. There was only 31,000 there, because they were milking it, No, in Scotland, of course. Well, not Easter Road.
So supposedly there was a gate at Hearts Rangers games that they wouldn't fill in the return that they had to give to the taxman. But interesting on that point, this year was the 120th anniversary of the use of the turnstiles at Tynecastle, and they've actually just got rid of using them for the last time, so it was the 120th birthday. So some of them are still getting used 120 years later, remarkable bits of engineering. Essentially, it's just you put your foot on the lever, and it rotates the thing like a quarter turn. And they were known as rush resistant and tamper proof. And I thought it was rust resistant in the handwritten minute book, but actually it was rush, so you couldn't rush through it. But tamper proof, so you couldn't actually open up the counter and put it backwards, so you weren't reporting the false numbers to the tax authorities.
I maybe shouldn't say this, but I'm not even going to name the individuals, but at least 2 Hibs chairmen were known to have their own turnstile. So anyone who went through that turnstile and paid the money didn't go to the club, But I'm sure the only reason I'm saying that, because it's just the Hibs, they would have all been doing that, all the clubs,
And just on that point, Hibs were the best team in Scotland in the late 40s, early 50s. Hearts were the best team in Scotland in the latter part of the 50s. But in Hearts' case, within sort of 15 years they got relegated. In the Hibs' case, sort of 20 years they got relegated. The money was not really put back into either the grounds or the team.